All right. Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to my podcast, Stationery Store for My Friends. My name is To My Friend, aka Hai Young, and I will be hosting a podcast per listener's request about caffeine during pregnancy. Now, I didn't want to just have a black screen for my podcast in case somebody wants to watch my video instead of just listening to it. I will have this little model going so that you guys have some visual stimuli when listening to my podcast, if so desired. But let's start off with the introduction to what caffeine is and see what the standard recommendations for caffeine are. So, dietary guidelines for Americans describe caffeine as a dietary component that functions in the body as a stimulant. So that is how the dietary guidelines for Americans describe caffeine. It is found in a lot of our beverages like coffee, tea, and soda. And it is also found in some foods, but most caffeine intake is through beverages that we consume. And caffeine is a substance that is generally recognized as safe by the Food and Drug Administration, aka FDA. And yeah, it is by the guidelines of Americans, dietary guidelines. For healthy adults, the FDA has cited 400 milligrams per day of caffeine is generally not associated with dangerous negative effects. So if they do say 400 milligrams per day isn't bad for regular adults. Caffeine is a huge part of our life. And in fact, I have some friends that states that they cannot live without caffeine. So it is a huge part of our lives. I personally drink a lot of caffeine, as a pre-workout, or if I have a test, I drink caffeine a little bit before the test. If I have work really early in the morning, I need caffeine to make my brain going and to function. So it's a huge part of our lives, and in fact, taking it away from some people, it might impact their life in a negative way, right? So let's talk about caffeine during pregnancy. Now, there's a lot of restrictions that come with pregnancy in terms of diet, and let's see how the regular guidelines say for caffeine during pregnancy. So caffeine does pass through the placenta from mother to fetus, but the dietary guideline does state that it does not usually adversely affect the infant or the fetus when consumed low to moderate amounts, about 300 milligrams or less per day, which is about 2 to 3 cups of coffee, right? So they say 300 milligrams or less. 2 to 3 cups of coffee. They don't really specify what kind of beverage it is. They just say coffee in broad terms. I think that's good to know because a lot of studies that I've looked at does not specify what kind of coffee or caffeinated beverages that a person drinks. They just state it as a caffeinated beverage. Or some studies just looked at cups of coffee that a person drank, but they don't account for any sort of different types of coffee. So when you guys are drinking coffee, different coffee might have different compositions, and the amount of caffeine that it has might differ. So it is your responsibility to know that, unfortunately. So do take that into consideration when you're drinking coffee. So the European Food Safety Authority actually has a different range for their recommendation for pregnancy, and they say 200 milligrams or less per day. And they don't think that 200 milligrams per day consumed throughout the day do not raise any safety concerns for the fetus. So that is a European guideline and not the American guideline. But it is very interesting to see two different values come out. Now I think it is a good time to mention that now I think it is a good time to mention that pregnancy is associated with slower caffeine metabolism. So that is something to keep in mind. It is mentioned in a study done by Ree in 2015 that pregnant women have slower caffeine metabolism with 1.5 to 3.5 times longer half-life needed to eliminate caffeine compared to non-pregnant women. Now, that is a pretty drastic difference, because half-life of caffeine is around 8 hours. So that is a long time that the caffeine stays in your system. But the half-life may differ based on the people, but yeah. So usually for caffeinated beverages, caffeine stays in your system for a long time, and pregnant women have slower caffeine metabolism, 1.5 to 3.5 times longer. So perhaps even with small amounts of caffeine consumption for pregnant women might have a more exaggerated effect, right? Because it stays in their system longer. And now that you know the guidelines and the general idea of what caffeine is, let's talk about some studies that research caffeine during pregnancy and why we should consider restricting its use during pregnancy. Now, a disclaimer: the fundamental rule of good nutrition, in my humblest opinion, is eating diverse food in moderation, with moderation being the key here. Anything, if consumed in excess amounts, can be bad for your health, and it really doesn't matter what it is, right? And when I say diverse, I mean diverse categories of food, like carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, and in a diverse way, a lot of greens and vegetables and fruits that bring in the micronutrients instead of the macronutrients. So when I say diverse, I mean diverse in food categories like those. If you make a case about how diverse your breakfast was and all you had was donuts, chips, cookies, croissants, wafers, and biscuits, yeah, they're very diverse, but they all fit into providing you more of carbohydrates than anything else. So I mean, it is diverse, but that's not the type of diversity that I'm talking about here. Even water could be bad for you if you drink excessive amounts of it than recommended. So yeah, back to the topic at hand. Now let's talk about some of the studies that I have researched that talks about caffeine during pregnancy and the potential risk that might come with that. A meta-analysis study, a very huge one, done by Jin and Xiao in 2021, showed that there is a positive association between caffeine during pregnancy and low birth weight. So this meta-analysis involved looking at 15 cohort studies, which added up to more than looking at 100,000 pregnant women. That is a lot of samples that we studied, right? 100,000 pregnant women. In the grand scheme of things, it might not be a lot, but it is a lot for a meta-analysis study. The risk estimates in most of the included studies were adjusted for potential confounders such as maternal age, education, pre-pregnancy BMI, maternal smoking and alcohol, drinking during pregnancy, maternal intake, maternal energy intake, which is the calorie intake, gestational age, and child's gender, and gestational diabetes, etc. And what this study found was that the dose risk for each 100 milligrams per day increase, the 100 milligrams per day increase in caffeine consumption showed 7% higher risk in low birth weight. And that risk went up to around 20% at 300 milligrams. And the maximum that this study predicted was a total of 33% risk increase with the highest level of caffeine. So that is That is a quite surprising finding, right? 100 milligrams per day, when the dietary guidelines and the European Food Safety Authority says around 200, around 300 milligrams of caffeine should be fine during pregnancy. This study says even 100 milligrams per day shows an increased risk, 7% higher, statistically significant increase in risk of low birth weight is present. So that is a very, very shocking result, right? Maybe this can lead our thoughts to thinking like, oh, so is caffeine really bad for us? Now, there's another similar meta-analysis done by Soltani in 2023 that shows similar results. In fact, almost very similar results. It does show positive association between caffeine consumption and during pregnancy and low birth weight. But I mentioned this after the first study because this study only looked at 7 studies. And some of the studies that she used for this meta-analysis did overlap with the previous study that I mentioned by Jin and Xiao. So I'm only adding this in here as a supplemental meta-analysis study that I looked at. This study also showed very similar findings. One of the hypotheses in the mechanism in this study, one of the hypotheses about the mechanism of why this is the case was mentioned in this study more clearly than the previous one, which is why I'm using this one, was that caffeine consumption during pregnancy is associated with reduced placental blood flow, and hypoxia that results from the blockage of adenosine receptors, as well as from increased epinephrine concentration in the mother and in the fetus. So they think that might be a mechanism in which it leads to low birth weight births. But it is simply a hypothesis, and it is not the definite mechanism of why this is the case. There's more studies that needs to be done in the mechanism of why this is. The results show, why this is. But it is a good thing to note here that these studies look at people who drink caffeine every day. Even at 100 milligrams of caffeine per day, that is 700 milligrams of caffeine per week. And I'm not sure if all of you guys count how much caffeine you consume throughout the week. But unless you drink caffeine every day, I highly don't think that the effects would be as drastic. But there needs to be a study that needs to be done on that in the future, which I am very curious about reading about if they ever do it. But yeah, I am a chronic drinker of caffeine as well. I drink at least 3 or 4 caffeinated drinks per week, but I always try to leave 1 or 2 days without caffeine in my system. And yeah, perhaps the risk would be reduced if somebody did that. So we do need to look into that, and do note that caffeine metabolism is slower in pregnant women. So even a little bit of caffeine can have more of a drastic effect, more of an exaggerated effect in them, perhaps, than us just drinking it. All right, and time to move on to another study that I found. This study is related to caffeine during pregnancy and IQ levels of infants and toddlers that are born. It is done by Galera It is done in the study by Galera in 2016. It is a very small cohort study. So, but I do mention this because I think that this study brings in some things that we can consider when drinking caffeine. So let me just describe you the study first. So it's a small study. In the end, the study ended with around 1,000 people, mother and child pairs, who completed up to the IQ test. So they started off with around 2,000, and they ended up with 1,000 people that did participate completely throughout the study, and they categorized the caffeine drinkers to 3 levels: low, from 0 to 100 milligrams per day, or less than 100. Moderate is 100 to less than 200 milligrams a day, and high is more than 200 milligrams a day. And they state that they chose this threshold because several health guidelines advise pregnant women to limit their caffeine consumption to less than 200 milligrams per day. So that is why, more than 200 was more. So it is good to note that dietary guidelines for Americans recommend less than 300. So that's we're already like on the high range of this study if people actually follow the guideline to the T, but they always drink around 300 milligrams a day. So that's something to note. So this study used Wechsler preschool and preliminary scale of intelligence as the measure of intelligence of the children. The abbreviation is WPPSI Roman numeral 3, so 3 I's. And in this study, that was used as a measurement of infants and toddlers' intelligence. And the food frequency questionnaire for this study encompassed the year before pregnancy to the last trimester of pregnancy. And last trimester of pregnancy is emphasized here because it is when a lot of brain development occurs. So the questionnaire comprised of questions on beverages containing caffeine, included number of cups and glasses of caffeine or regular drinks of caffeine per day, per day, per month, per week, etc. And what they found was that prenatal caffeine exposure was negatively associated with children's IQ. So more caffeine equals less IQ. And at age 5.5 years approximately. And whether caffeine and IQ... Okay, let me back up for a second. And the association remains statistically significant after adjusting for ranges of potential co-founders, including socioeconomic variables, maternal alcohol, and maternal smoking. So those confounders were looked at and adjusted for. And what they found was that children of mothers who consumed more than 200 milligrams per day had a significantly lower scale IQ compared with children of mother who consumed less than 100 milligrams per day during pregnancy. And the IQ that I see here is the people that consumed more caffeine had children's averaging about 100.5 IQ versus 100.5 IQ versus 103.7. So around like 3 IQ difference that is statistically significant in the full scale IQ, and the performance IQ was 96.3 versus 100.2. So that's also around 3 to 4 IQ level difference. They did not find any difference in verbal IQs. But yeah. And people that drank more caffeine were more likely to have borderline or lower intellectual functioning IQ scores. So that's very interesting. But some variation may be from the fact that the mother consuming more than 200 milligrams of per day of caffeine were also more likely to consume alcohol and tobacco during pregnancy, and to be multifarious and less likely to have breastfed for more than 6 months. So that's a variable that we should consider in this study that they mentioned. One of the hypotheses on the mechanism of this was that prenatal caffeine exposure at a micromolar human concentration could specifically block adenosine receptors during brain maturation, altering the ways that the brain is quote-unquote wired. That is quote-unquote from myself, because I did not want to describe all the neural circuits that they're describing here, because we're not neuroscientists. So I put in that word wired as easier way to describe it, but maybe that is the wrong way of describing it. During its critical development time. So I think this is something that is interesting to look at. So during critical brain development time, exposure to caffeine might alter the way that the brain develops. There's no conclusive understood mechanism as to why the study shows lower IQs for mothers that consume more caffeine. But I think this study is good to look at, just so that we can consider our caffeine consumption during certain critical time periods of children's development, such as brain development, or if we're going back to low birth weight again, perhaps during the time the baby is growing rapidly in its body weight, maybe caffeine might affect that in a negative way. But this IQ study in particular is a very small study, very small cohort study. So I do think that maybe in future studies this might be proven as statistically insignificant, but it is good to think about this when we are consuming caffeine. And I think it is important now to mention that everybody handles caffeine differently. The people's body react to caffeine differently. Some people are more caffeine sensitive than others. So I do think that you should drink with your own discretion. The European Food Safety Authority, like I said, recommends around 3 milligrams per kilograms per caffeine use, and to not use more than 200 milligrams per single dose. That is what the European Food Safety Authority recommends. And I think that is a pretty good recommendation, but that is for non-pregnant people. They recommend consumption up to 200 milligrams per day for people who are pregnant. So I do think that is a good range, but perhaps with the findings of the meta-analysis study that shows that even 100 milligrams per day can increase the low birth weight risk up to 7%, perhaps that could be taken into consideration when you are drinking caffeine at every single day at a regular basis. Perhaps you can skip a couple of days. That could be in consideration to your diet during pregnancy. But yeah, that is what I want to talk to you guys about. There's some more studies that I have done, but those are all very small, so I did not want to include that in my podcast. But yeah, thank you for coming to the Stationery Store for My Friends podcast, hosted by To My Friend, aka Hayang, and I hope to see you guys next time. Thank you so much for joining in. Bye.